Hey guys, it's me again, Sean for Microbudget Film Lab, and today in this video I'm going to talk about the one-room wonders and the kind of movies that are made with one-room wonders, and to help you structure your own story. And it's based on the booklet or the case study that I did that's available for download off of Facebook. So you can get it there and read it. It's a pretty quick read. It's like 30 pages, maybe 32 pages. And it's worth going through that and having that as a reference tool for you. But I wanted to give maybe an additional video thing, because sometimes you miss things reading. Sometimes it's nice to have a video accompanying or whatever. And I was asked by some people if I would do that. So I'm going to do that in a relatively quick sort of way, go through the various categories. Now, the thing is, what I've modeled this on, this breakdown of story type, is not on genre per se, sci-fi versus, drama or whatever. I've modeled it on story type, following the model that Blake Snyder uses in Save the Cat, which I know some people think is a book that's too mechanical in its approach to storytelling. But I actually disagree, because I think you have to take everything critically, and the thing about I think these guys who write books on screenwriting often box themselves in ways by claiming that their model is the only model and all other models fail to do it. Blake Snyder in Save the Cat makes some jokes about the movie Memento by I forgot his name, but how silly it was, nobody watched it, it's too obscure, blah blah blah, it doesn't follow his model. Well, looking back in retrospect, after the director went on to make the Batman remakes and Dunkirk and so on, looks absolutely absurd, because that movie made his career. And it wasn't that, if Snyder had taken a moment to actually look at the structure of Memento, rather than, I think maybe he didn't even watch it, I don't know, he would have seen that it was actually a clever use of what he basically lays out in his book in terms of plot points, but doing them in reverse. So there was rising action in it, in the way that he talked about. There's turning points. There's in the way that he talked about it, and all that sort of stuff. So in fact, it would have been a useful example to say, hey, you can use my book, but you don't have to use it uncritically. You can use it in a way that helps you. Another book that I started to read, a story by John Truby. I actually didn't finish it. I read some of it, and some of it's useful in terms of construction of character, and I'll maybe talk about some of that in some later videos, about constructing characters in opposition to each other and in opposition to a central goal and their relationship to a central goal and so on. But he goes on at length over and over and over again about how everybody else is wrong. There's been a lot of centuries of story theory going back to at least Aristotle. And people have been making plays and writing novels and stuff for a long time before John Truby came along. They surely knew something about constructing stories, so a little modesty, I think, is in order there, which is not to say he doesn't have some useful tools that he gives you, but that kind of thing just kind of gets under my skin when people claim to have solved the problem of story. And in the end, I found his method to actually creating story structure to be kind of muddled and confusing to me. It didn't really work for me, but the character part did. Anyway, so you can take bits and pieces and learn how to use these things creatively. And I include my own, what I say absolutely there. Like I'm, to go back to the One Room Wonders, I have a series of categories of different kinds of movies, different kinds of stories that I think exist for One Room Wonders. But those, any category is a distillation of things, and so it's never totally one thing. In real life, in real stories as they exist, tend to blur the lines to a greater or lesser degree, and so it's important to engage with my stuff critically as well, and understand that it's not the be all and end all, and to be flexible about it, understanding what is the dominant thread in the story. There's for instance, one of the categories I talk about, a puzzle to solve, is the first type of story that I talk about, and that is a story in which people are trapped in a room that has certain rules that may be magical or scientific, often a blurring of the line between those two things, and they need to find a way to get out by figuring out the rules of that room or that space. In the case of the one I love, for instance, they're in a house on a, well, it's sort of an estate, and they're in a house, but there's also a guest house beside the estate where they're staying. And so they're moving between those spaces. It's not strictly speaking a one room wonder, but it's a one space wonder or one location wonder. They're kind of sometimes outside or sometimes inside. And there's a couple of short scenes where they're outside of the estate, but primarily the action takes place in the estate itself. Anyway, a puzzle to solve is, a clear story. Moon, he's trying to get off the moon, Sam Rockwell. Exam, they're trying to be the one that passes the exam, gets out of the room alive, and gets the job because they need the job to have access to healthcare. Interestingly, in this moment in time, as we're trapped in a room, I guess you could watch that and it might give you anxiety attacks thinking about your own situation. Maybe if you're in the United States, you don't have medical insurance and you're in quarantine, it's got to be pretty high anxiety. Cube, again, is one space, but there's another story structure that in some ways is similar. Well, I mean, they're all similar and they're within one room, but the story of, outwit the opponent. It's not the room per se that is blocking the exit of a person alive from that situation, but it's a puzzle that they have to solve to get out of that room. They're trying to get out of the room in some way. Often, Rope, the movie Rope by Hitchcock, Jimmy Stewart's not exactly trying to get out of the room, but he's trying to get out of the room that is his ideology. The room represents his ideology, and he has this sort of Ayn Rand kind of super libertarian ideology that he's taught his students, or I think he's was the dorm master, or the head, like the floor master, whatever, like a fellow student who's like a more senior student, who conveyed his ideas to these other two students who murder a fourth student who they believe is not as superior to them, or is not as superior as them, who are wealthy and have maids and so on, and he's kind of like a regular guy, and so therefore they have the right to impose their desires upon him, in this case by strangling him with a rope. And so Jimmy Stewart he needs to get out of the room in a sense of his mind that is the ideology that he taught them, and he can only do that by solving the murder and realizing the horror of the horrible conclusion of his ideas. And it wouldn't surprise me if Hitchcock was inspired by having lived through the period of Nazism in the Second World War, and the horror of and the madness of where the ideas of Nazism led in terms of the Holocaust and all that. But be that as it may, it's so you see that there is a corollary. There are commonalities between a puzzle to solve, which is about solving the mystery of the magical room and getting out alive, and solving the problem in the room that allows you to get out alive or to get out. There's another version of Outwit the Opponent is Wait Till Dark with Audrey Hepburn, where she has to get out of, she's blind, and she's ended up with a doll that's got drugs in it, and Alan Arkin, I believe, is the mob boss, drug dealer guy who's come for the drugs and is going to kill her because she's a witness. And so she puts out the lights in the room because she's blind, and so then she has an advantage because she knows the room really well, whereas he's blind because there's no light and doesn't know the room. And so she has a problem to solve to get out of the room alive. But again, the room isn't the problem. It's the person in the room that is the problem, that is the obstacle to her escaping. And in some ways, it's about her overcoming her fears and her insecurities, being a blind person and becoming a stronger person in the process. That's sort of her arc. Now that, in some ways, is similar, again, to a puzzle to solve movie Exam, in which you have a group of people who need to, as I said, need to pass the exam. But the exam isn't simply like, solving math problems, an aptitude test, or any of that sort of thing, and whatever, that kind of test. Instead, it's a series of puzzles related to the room, but they're all competing with each other, and they have to in a sense, kind of kill each other or allow each other to die in a way so that the number of people in the room is reduced, thereby increasing their chances to get out of the room and to get the job that they need. So again, they're in competition with each other. So the room is structuring their problems, but they're in competition with each other, which is in a sense very similar to the Audrey Hepburn movie Wait Till Dark, where the room is structuring problems by being in pitch blackness and having obstacles in the room, the couch, the lamp, the tables, and so on. But it's in competition with this other guy. But the fundamental problem is the other guy and not the magical character of the room. So again, just to show how there can be blurring between the different categories. So those are two of them: a puzzle to solve on the one hand, and outwit the opponent on the other. And I've defined them like that because it speaks to the emphasis in each of them. The puzzle to solve, there's a problem in the room to solve. Outwit the opponent, there's a person to overcome through solving it. Now, the next one is close to, in some ways, outwit the opponent. It's called the reckoning. And the reckoning is that people get trapped themselves in a space, a common space, and they have to solve some past problem that they need to overcome in order to successfully escape the space, in a sense. Again, it's about escaping the space in a certain way. You know, the movie Tape with Ethan Hawke is about two old friends get together in a hotel. He's in town, and one of them has a tape of the other supposedly raping Uma Thurman. Or he doesn't have a tape, but he claims that he raped Uma Thurman a decade earlier, and he tapes him confessing to the rape, even though he doesn't believe that he raped Uma Thurman. And then Uma Thurman shows up and is then being used by the two of them, one to prove that he's got moral superiority because he is confronting the rapist, and the other trying to prove that he is trying to use Uma Thurman to get her to say that he is innocent, in a sense. So again, it all takes place inside of a hotel room, revolving around this tape. And so in some ways, and the celebration, to talk about the celebration, it's in a state kind of like the one I love, but it's a family has come together for the 60th birthday of this sort of family patriarch who's a kind of not very pleasant guy. He associates with far right, there's some far right elements in the family. One of the daughters of his is actually on the far left and has showed up with her new boyfriend, who is a black man. It's a Danish movie, I believe. Yeah, Danish movie. It's part of the Dogma 95 movies, which had a very strict code about how you could make your movie. Lars von Trier is in it. The maker of The Celebration is in it. And you can't use any. The only lighting you can use is practical lighting, like I'm using right now, a light in my office, and there's lights behind me. No music except that plays over a radio, no soundtrack kind of thing. There's a bunch of rules in there that worth checking out if you want to incorporate an extra challenge into your one room wonder. But there was the man whose birthday is being celebrated had a set of twins who are adults now. One of whom committed suicide the year before, and the other one, the brother, it was the fraternal twins, a sister and a brother, and the brother is now wants to confront his father about his sexual abuse of the twins when they were children, which is what led to the suicide of his sister. So it's a pretty unhappy movie, and a lot of people are not very pleasant people to watch in it. And because it's shot according to these dogma rules, it often looks, and this is a little while ago now, is it the 90s? I can't remember the date of it. But it's, before smartphones, before really high quality digital cameras, probably shot on tape. So it looks pretty terrible by and large, but the story is so good that you really lose yourself in it. And so again, this what you see is these high stakes where a guy needs to, in order for himself to avoid the future that happened to his sister, the suicide, he needs to unburden himself of this torment that he's carried all these years by confronting his father in the middle of a family celebration with, a dozen and a half people, and face his father to face up to the horror of what he put upon his children. And it's so well structured as a story that you kind of forget how bad it looks, which is sort of interesting and is an important point when you think about, people ask me, well, I don't have a lot of equipment at home. How am I going to shoot this? And the key is, as always, a really strong story will cause people to forget about the technical failings. Good sound is key, which you can do for relatively cheap, especially in enclosed spaces where you don't have problems of wind and so on, especially if there's not a lot of planes going overhead or a lot of traffic noise outside. But the key is a good story. And here you had a really good story with really high stakes. And, again, in terms of some of the blending of categories, while there's no magic involved generally in The Reckoning, it's generally, by and large, about people facing their past and reckoning with their past. Nonetheless, it's about dealing with personal issues that allow you to get over it. And the movie, The One I Love, that I talked about, it's about a couple overcoming their the weakness in their relationship, which has developed over time, and finding in the other person the ideal that they would want in their relationship in order to rediscover love. So in some ways, and it's a comedy, so it's, Tape and The Reckoning are both pretty dark stories and not really comedic, but there's something in common in terms of, the problem faced is one of failures in the past that have created a situation in the present that is imprisoning the characters. But in a puzzle to solve, the main characters, that problem of the past, that reckoning in a sense, is manifest through a magical space that they have to try to escape from. Whereas in The Reckoning, there's no magic. It's really, they need to face up to the past in a real sense, very concretely and specifically, deal with the rape or not rape of the girlfriend in the past, in this cause of Uma Thurman, dealing with your assumptions about who you were in the past and facing up to your failings and so on. The celebration, dealing with a past case of abuse and how to overcome that. There's no magical way out of this. It's makes it kind of harder hitting. It'd be hard to, I guess you could do it as a comedy too, but it would have to be I think it'd probably be a fairly dark comedy if you're reckoning with something in the past, unless you deliberately flip it on its head and the thing you're reckoning with is something absolutely superficial, like, you haven't been able to get over the fact that your parent flushed the turtle down the toilet or something when you were age 8. I don't know. I haven't seen one of those. If you've seen a Reckoning type one room wonder like that, put it in the conversation below in Facebook. So those are 3 now that we've talked about: a puzzle to solve, outwit the opponent, and The Reckoning. In the book, there's I'm going to skip the third one in the book and come back to it because it's the most different, I think, than the other ones. In the sense of how it approaches the question of conflict and stakes, and instead move to the 5th one, which is We Got a Big Problem. And this 5th one, We Got a Big Problem, has really 2 parts, or I've broken it into 2 parts: We Got a Big Problem general and Gladiator in the Ring. And what differentiates these 2 is not, in a sense, the stakes per se. It is because they can be life and death in both, but that the former, We Got a Big Problem, is really much more talky and much more dialogue based as a way to solve the problem. And the Gladiator in the Ring is much more about action and solving problems through the action of the characters. And so it's different both in that, but it also means it's higher budget. And you're faced with a problem if you choose to do that. The Hateful Eight, I think, and All Is Lost with Robert Redford's, where he's on a boat that's sinking and he's by himself. So it's a unique idea of a single location, as is that movie where that couple is trapped in the water. I've forgotten the name of it, but they're trapped in the water for like 8 hours, surrounded by sharks, and they're just in one location, the open water, I think it's called, isn't it? and there's sharks. So that's also a unique use of the idea of single location. So there are many ways to approach single location. You can't because you're trapped in your house and garden, maybe. So you can maybe shoot it up a tree or something, trapped by, I don't know, that raccoon in a tree. Killer raccoons. The Hateful Eight is in a bar inn, and both of those have a lot of visual effects in them. I mean, Robert Redford is in a sound stage that's designed for water, with a boat, with storms, with all this stuff going on that you're not probably can't replicate that. I mean, you could do it. One of the things that you could do that's kind of funny, that you could kind of break the rules in a sense. I don't know if there was a movie that made this guy's career many years ago, the Karen Carpenter story. Todd Solondz, I think, did it. And he does the whole movie with Barbie dolls, which is sort of a comment on the construction of Karen Carpenter, which led to her tragic death by anorexia or bulimia. And just like a clever way to overcome the problem of how do you, when you have no money, do it. So, moving, like, literally, this is not stop action. This is like you see the hands moving and then hear the voices, hey, Karen, did you do X? Did you record the new song? No, I didn't. So you could do that. If you've got a jacuzzi in your house, you could do remake the classic A Night to Remember. Is that what it's called? The original Titanic movie. You could make it in your jacuzzi. I would be really impressed with that if somebody would go and do that. One of those movies that's now out of, I'm not sure if A Night to Remember is yet out of copyright, but it might be something you could do. So those are action movies, and they're hard to do. Blood splatters, gunfire, all that stuff. And if you try to do it for cheap, downloading those free, special effects of like bullets, boop, 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 and the light comes out the finger, boop, boop, boop. It's gonna look cheesy, and that you could use that. But if you try to make it pretend like that, none of us think that it's actually cheesy, it's gonna fall in the cheesy realm rather than being like brilliantly ironic and fun, I think, in my opinion. So we got a big problem. This is, again, it's not about magic. There's no sci-fi generally here. It's really about, it's in a space, like a puzzle to solve, but the problem exists in a sense outside of the space. And they have to solve the problem rather than solving the problem inside the space, as with The Reckoning, as with a puzzle to solve, or even outwit the opponent. They're trying to solve a problem that exists outside the space. In Locke, it's the lead character in a car trying to solve 3 simultaneous problems. So he's at no loss of what to do over the phone. So he's on kind of hands-free while he's driving in the car. His mistress, his one-night stand. He's married, he had a one-night stand. She became pregnant. She's now giving birth. He feels like it's his obligation to fix his mess and to support her because she's decided to keep the child. And so he's driving to the hospital where she's giving birth. At the same time, he is a boss on a skyscraper project, and he is the sort of cement boss who's pouring the foundations the next day. And so by leaving, he is leaving this billion-dollar project without an experienced leader, and it's going to cost him his career by leaving. But he's principled, and so he's going to do it. And so he's trying, but he also wants to fix the problem. So he's getting his assistant to, he's walking him through the process of making the pour happen, make sure it's the right cement that they're using, and so on. And thirdly, he's got to tell his wife where he's going. Honey, I just quit my job because I'm going to be by the side of my one-night stand with whom I'm now having a baby. And so he's got to try to convince her to forgive him and to understand that he's trying to do the right thing in the face of this terrible error that he's made. So he's trying to solve all these simultaneous problems outside of his car. And in a sense, he can't leave his car until he's solved them. That's the escape from the space. So it's all in the car. There may be, one shot, I think at the beginning, there's maybe some shots from outside the car to kind of give variety, but the rest of it is like kind of front on the actor, Tom, what's his face? from Fury Road, and him solving the problems. Another one's Siete Años, or 7 years. It's a Netflix movie. It was made in Spain, like another movie I talked about in a separate video, The Platform, La Plataforma. Also a Spanish movie. Spain makes some really good movies and some good series, actually, worth watching. Casa de Papel or The Money Heist, very good movie, or good series. But Siete Años is, again, the problem is outside. It's these five partners who have to decide, 5 or 4 of them? I think there's 4 of them, and then there's the mediators, the 5th. And they've been cheating on their taxes, effectively, and they've been caught, and one of them is going to go to jail for 7 years, and they have to decide who is the most disposable, in a sense, to go to jail for those 7 years. So they have a problem outside, and they have to solve that problem exterior to the space in order to, for the rest of the people anyway, to get out of that space and move forward. 12 Angry Men, a classic movie about the jury, 12 people on a jury. They have to decide whether someone is guilty or not. If they decide guilty, that suspect or the charged man will get the death penalty. And there's one person who disagrees and thinks that they're not guilty, and they have to convince the other people in the room that person is not guilty in order to solve the problem which exists outside. And in that way, they can leave, and they can't leave. The guy won't let them leave until they come to a not guilty verdict. He's very stubborn. So again, you're seeing some commonalities in between all these films. I'm going on a long time, so I'm going to wrap this up. But I want to get to some of the commonalities in all these. All of them is, first of all, really high stakes. These are kind of life and death stakes that are happening here, life-changing stakes, if not life and death itself. So you want to set the stakes as high as you can in the space, that people are going to die or their lives are going to be destroyed or transformed in some way. The one I love is a comedy, and they're not going to die, but their marriage is going to end, which is also high stakes. In a sense, it's primal. I think as Blake Snyder calls it, primal stakes, something that is really profound to you. Getting money is not, as I've said in other places, doesn't move people in the same way. People like money, we all like money, but really they want money for something else. So you want to get to the sort of root, you want to get behind the avatar, as I talked about in the other video, to the real stakes that are going on. You want to think about the exterior stakes versus the emotional stakes. One character wants to catch the other one. His goal, rather, is that he wants to get the other character in the movie on tape confessing to the rape of Uma Thurman. What is his interior emotional goal? What does he need in order to, that he's going to satisfy through this external goal that he's pursuing, that there's these two things going on? That isn't always the case. Now the last one, so those are some of the things you need to think about. You need to think about stakes, you need to think about a character arc and a story arc with rising action, that each obstacle becomes harder than the previous obstacle. And I encourage you to watch some of these movies, see how each time the challenges are becoming greater to them. The character arc, the character has to transform over the course of the story from one position to another, and I talk about this in detail in relationship to The Platform, and I talk about it in the book itself. So you need to think about where they start. You want to give them the greatest distance to travel from where they start and where they end up, so that it's the most profound arc that you can possibly create. So those are some of the things you need to think about when you watch these movies. Now the last one that I want to talk about that's different than the others, the type of story, is called Let's Talk About It. And Let's Talk About It is often plot-free. There's no clear goal or stakes that they're trying to, in a concrete sense, like get out of the room, don't get killed, save your marriage, confront your pedophile father, whatever. Instead, it's really about people just sitting around kind of talking, a day in the life of, a moment in the life of, and so these, the 3 examples that I use in the book are, My Dinner with Andre, Breakfast Club, and Clerks. And I think the key thing in all 3 of those, and they're similar movies in the sense that they're really just very, very talky movies with a little bit of hijinks going on, in especially in Breakfast Club and Clerks. There's more action. The young people, they play, in Clerks, they play a game of hockey on the roof of the convenience store, and in Breakfast Club, they get high and they run around the school a little bit outside of the space in which they're supposed to have their detention. But by and large, what they do is when they're not breaking up the talking with those kinds of team building activities, is that they talk about their lives and they talk about the moment that they live in. And these are really social commentary, entertaining social commentary that connect with the sort of dominant zeitgeist, the spirit of the moment that people are experiencing. And to work, I think, they have to in some way connect with that moment. And that requires luck, potentially, being tuned into what's going on. And I think, I'm intellectually inclined. I like to kind of think things through rather than being kind of emotionally inclined and just kind of feel my way through. I think it requires some research and thinking about you need to be tuned in, and not just with your mates, but also like what's going on in the world. What's the significance of the concerns that you say your friends and family have in relationship to the world around them, so that you can give some weight and some profundity to the conversation that people are having. So it doesn't just feel like the kind of conversation that it needs to feel like the conversation that people are having, but in a way that goes a little bit deeper into that. I mean, My Dinner with Andre is in some ways unrelatable. It's, an actor and a director of theater getting together to talk about theater and philosophies of life and philosophies of the good life through the experiences that they've had. And one of them is the actor is challenging the director, or no, he's a writer who's challenging the director, and they just talk. And while they're being served different courses of a meal, and the director shares little stories and that kind of thing. Again, we watch it; it feels dated. The camera work feels dated, but it was an extremely well-received movie that won a lot of awards and did really well. And it's worth thinking about it and locating it at the moment in history in which it was made in the 1980s, in terms of a sense of, the rise of the decay of the kind of zeitgeist of collectivism that had dominated the mid-60s through the mid-70s, and then sort of decayed into individualism, into atomized individuals, and how that affected people's relationship to culture, particularly amongst a certain set of people. Maybe you think that that's best, that maybe you're kind of a libertarian or something, and you believe that people should only relate as individuals and not as collectivities, in which case you would flip it on its head, that particular view. So you need to kind of know what's going on in the world, I think, to understand where it's coming from. To understand, for instance, I was doing some research on women in the modernist art scene in Paris, because there's a really fascinating scene of women who were key to modernist literature, modernist art. Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas were part of this in Paris post-World War I. Well, even pre-World War I, but especially post-World War I, where you got the Lost Generation, and you got Ernest Hemingway and James Joyce and so on. And the Lost Generation writings of Ernest Hemingway and the people around him was an expression of a certain worldview that came out of the First World War. This was, as the name implies, the first World War that had ever happened. That sense of optimism that had existed prior to World War I, that it could, that war was coming to an end. The countries of Europe were cooperating more and more. They were integrated more and more. People from Berlin would go to Paris. People from Paris would go to Rome or Madrid or whatever. There was this sense of multiculturalism and stuff. People theorized that it was the end of war. And then suddenly, out of seemingly nowhere, there was this cataclysmic war in which millions of people died in these horrific trench battles. And many of these writers, like Ernest Hemingway, lived through the war. And so their writing reflected that. If you've read Hemingway, his sentences are very short. I walked across the room. I picked up a glass. I drank the water. I fired the gun. She was dead. But that sense of emotionally flat emptiness that dominated a certain sector of people who went through that experience. And that relates to, let's talk about it in the sense of knowing the zeitgeist of what people are feeling. And you see some of that out there now, the talk of Generation Z and millennials and how they're dealing with the current contradictions that exist in their lives and so on. And you see it in older people as well, dealing with the contradictions and how they're grasping with those. I think it requires, one final thing that I'll say, I think it requires respecting those, no matter your particular viewpoint on those things, you have to respect the people that you're going to portray. Otherwise it comes across as kind of condescending and insulting. And even if you don't agree with them, I'm pretty left-wing, but when I look at people in, say, the United States who are older, who tend to be more religious, maybe are evangelical. I'm not religious, but if I'm going to portray those people, and religion appears a lot in my writing, even though I'm not religious, because I find it an interesting and valid way to try to understand the world, even if I don't agree with it, and I think that it's got problems and so on, as religious people would think about my worldview, of course. If I'm going to portray those people and try to interrogate that, I want to do it in a way that humanizes them so that I can learn from who those people are and why they do that, why they, do whatever, and so that other people can view it. Because part of what I see my role is as somebody who's progressive is to try to bridge that divide between, say, young progressives or progressives in general, and a certain kind of dismissal that they have of people who maybe are older, people who are more religious or more conservative, and find common ground, that people are using different tools to get at the same thing. So if you're going to explore that stuff, I think you need to kind of take that sort of empathetic view in order to have it not just be annoying. Like I watched a movie, there was kind of a one-room wonder, and I never got through it actually, called The Last Supper, and it was about these liberals who, and I think in the end it sort of redeemed itself, but I never made it to the end because they just annoyed me so much, that these liberals were, decide to have these dinners and kill right-wingers by poisoning them, and that was their contribution to making the world a more liberal, better place that was more open and so on. The irony of killing people you disagree with being lost on the characters, which sort of, I think, becomes apparent in the end, is kind of the tables are kind of turned. But at first it just annoyed me because these people were so smug and so elitist towards people who were of a different viewpoint. And I didn't feel that the writer of the movie did a good job of, at that moment, of conveying or humanizing the people. As I say, I gathered that they do in the end, but I didn't get that far because I couldn't bear to see people belittled in that way. I just don't like that kind of thing. And I think you have a stronger film and a stronger story if you have that empathy. So I'm going to stop there because I've now gone on almost 40 minutes. It's a really long, really long view of the One Room Wonders. And if you have any questions or comments or other examples of One Room Wonders that you've seen and how they fit into this model, both in terms of the story type and in terms of the kind of stakes and conflict and character arc and so on, the transformation, the theme that they explore, as I discussed in the first one, the theme is an argument about what it means to live the good life. Please do put it in underneath in the Facebook, on the Facebook discussion, or on the YouTube page, because I post these on YouTube because I want to, and we'll have that conversation because I think it's a good conversation. So until the next video, where we talk about some of the ways to begin to organize your story concepts into something coherent. Best of luck with your projects moving forward, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Bye for now.